Okay, so in terms of class today, I've been using the figures of Hipsters and Bogans to discuss aspects of this. So I think a good way to kind of think about symbolic violence, think about economic and cultural aspects of class is the Bogan is a good figure to think this through, and particularly what's been called the cashed up Bogan. And this generally relates more often to kind of fly in, fly out coal miners. What's interesting about this is that the mining industry is often estimated by Australians to be like 20% of our GDP, but really in reality it's somewhere between 2 or 4, depending on how you measure it. But mining has this kind of huge economic importance in Australia, much more than its actual economic contribution. And people tend to kind of support mining and want it to keep going. But what's interesting about that is the people that actually do it often experience symbolic violence. They're kind of called bogans. So these are kind of good indications, I think, of the kind of weird juxtapositions between different aspects of class relations and the economy and the cultural. So there's a YouTube link there to, I think, a Today Tonight or Current Affair story about cashed up bogans. So take the time, just have a quick look at that. It only goes for the usual kind of 5 minutes or whatever that those stories go for. And the cashed up bogan, I think, is a way to kind of think about middle class, high cultural capital kind of groups and people's orientation towards those with a lower cultural capital. But you can see there's kind of almost a jealousy here of the money they earn. So there's a kind of cashed up bogan is relatively high in economic capital, has no cultural capital, and for those with relatively high economic and cultural capital, there's this kind of jealousy and downward envy about that. So I think that's well expressed in the way that the cashed up bogan is often denigrated and had the piss taken out of it in various media examples. If you're more interested in that kind of stuff, check out the chapters that I write about hipsters and bogans in my book, Youth, Class and Everyday Culture. So have a quick look at that, and then I'll move on to the next slide. It's really important when considering aspects of class that we kind of think about other intersecting forms of inequalities. So we've looked at gender in the course already. Gender complicates analysis of class. Class has tended to be measured in various ways around the idea of the family, where each member of the family is kind of seen in the same class, and that can kind of true in many cultural and economic senses, but it kind of renders much of the labour that women do invisible. And as we looked at in the week on gender, the idea of the double shift and the way that women increasingly kind of have expectations to kind of earn money but still do all the domestic labour and child rearing. So in many ways we can see how that kind of patriarchal system props up the class system, but also puts women in that kind of double bind. More in other ways to think about the way that this kind of class and gender interact is that as the casualisation of the labour force has kind of taken hold and more jobs are less and less secure, women tend to be the ones that take up those insecure positions more and suffer all kinds of different consequences in terms of the money they earn throughout their career. This is particularly the case where even relatively well-educated middle-class professionals who maybe get divorced later in life, it's the woman who obviously suffers severe financial distress because of the way that things like superannuation and stuff like that become unequal when the woman has to take time off to rear children and things like that. Things like more diverse family structures also kind of challenge this system, and certainly that idea of the patriarchal dividend plays a real role in kind of complexifying the way that class and gender interact. So later in the course we'll look at race and ethnicity, and of course these interact with kind of class dynamics as well, and we'll look at some aspects of that in that week. So in terms of what we've been doing this week, I've been introducing class as a way of analysing inequality, material inequalities and cultural inequalities. But like most prominent sociological concepts, there's kind of critique about how vital, how useful the idea of class is. So through the late 20th century, there was kind of challenges to the idea of class. Basically, as we kind of moved from performing our identities through our production, like our identities based on our jobs, more through consumption practices, the things we like and the things we wear and the things we eat. It was argued that this means that class is not as useful, but I think Bourdieu shows that that's not really the case. Also, there's been a rise in kind of the idea of the middle class, in the sense that even people relatively low in the kind of hierarchy of how much people earn have access to consumer goods and relative comforts. So some would argue that this challenges the idea of class hierarchy. But again, the research about it shows that, people, regardless of whether they have access to, having a smart TV or an iPhone, if they have less money, if they have less cultural capital, it's likely to increase things like health problems and stuff like that as well. Others talk about the kind of relationship between class and politics has changed, that people often vote against their economic interests, and this means that there's less of a class consciousness. And so there's kind of, certainly I would argue that's kind of legitimate in some ways, but the way that politics is enacted through voting and stuff like that certainly doesn't kind of represent the way that people do all of their politics. And in fact, there's still many examples of lifestyle politics that have close relations to class. We'll talk about some of those lifestyle politics later in the course when we look at youth, and particularly around subcultures. So overall, stats still show there's a huge amount of inequality, and it seems to be increasing. And so I would argue myself that class is obviously still a very vital concept to think about how inequality works. And there's actually an essay in the course that you can choose to kind of discuss whether Australia's kind of, whether class is still a relevant concept to use. I mentioned in one of the earlier videos that there's a kind of website you can type in how much money you earn, or how much your household or how much your family earns or whatever, and you can kind of get a bit of an idea of where you rank in the kind of global percentages in terms of, whether you're top 1%, top 10%, top 50% or whatever of earners. And that's a way, I think, of allowing us to think about our place in terms of the class system, more so as a more international, global relation. As I said earlier as well, most of the class analysis have tend to focus on what happens within nation states, but since the kind of the rise of globalization, which we'll do a whole week on later in the course, there's been new ways of thinking about class that kind of looks at it as a more global relation. So Manuel Castells, in his work on what he calls the information age and the network society, argues that the new class system, rather than the bourgeoisie and the ruling class, or the ruling middle and working class within countries, needs to be thought of a more global level. And he talks about the networkers, the networked, and the switched off. For Castells, the networkers are kind of the elite, highly educated, professional middle classes, and the kind of older school ruling class, those that kind of benefit most from the way that kind of information is now key part of how capitalism works. And there's kind of information workers are the kind of new ruling class. The networked are the ones that kind of tend to their gardens, serve them coffee, and that kind of thing, clean their houses. And then there's literally billions of people that are kind of switched off from that system. Bauman, in similar ways, talks about tourists and vagabonds, relating here to the way people can or can't move around the world. And John Murray's work on mobility and network capital relates to this as well. The tourist is kind of the wealthy Westerner who has the right skin colour, the right passport, that can move around the world relatively unfettered. Obviously, this is a pre-COVID world. The vagabond is kind of more the person that's pushed by global forces to move around the world to find work and to, avoid political persecution or climate change. For Bauman, this leads to all kinds of what he calls wasted lives and the collateral casualties of consumerism, which we'll look at in some detail later when we when we do the week on consumerism. Ulrich Beck has been a kind of key critic of class analysis. He argues that where Marx sketched out we live in a class society, Beck argues we now live in a risk society. So where class was the key organising principle of the industrial and post-industrial world, for Beck, from the kind of late 20th century on, we live in a risk society, where risk and our exposure to it is the key organising principle of society. This doesn't necessarily destroy the old class system, but what Beck argues is that while more wealthy people or people with more cultural capital may have the ability to shield themselves from some risks in many ways, there's these huge new risks such as nuclear war or nuclear fallout, climate change, things like pandemics that might, affect all people beyond the class system. The example he uses is smog. If you live in a global city, you're breathing in that smog if you're, a rich professional in the upper levels of the building or the person that has to come in to clean it. So we'll look at that in some detail later on as well. Low Equal Quant writes about what he calls urban outcasts and advanced marginality. And what he's writing about here is the kind of rise of what have been colloquially called ghettos in, global Western cities, and how inequality in there is increasingly criminalised. Michel Agia writes about the rise of refugees and the way that they're pushed and pulled around the world in what he calls managing the undesirables. Here a key class relation again, like Ari and Bauman talk about, is who can move around the world freely and not. A really prominent new way of thinking about class, or one that develops on some of the old ways and develops a new form of class, a new class category, is Guy Standing's The Precariat. He talks about how globalization processes have led to a kind of class around the world that are increasingly precarious positions, left with no full-time work, constantly trying to find work, lots of casualised jobs. And this is happening up the class system as even kind of relatively highly educated people, their professions or whatever are increasingly casualised, and it's rarer and rarer to have a full-time job. So these are new ways of thinking about class that move beyond nation states and think about kind of global forces as a way of thinking about class. So to conclude, overall this week we've looked at levels of inequality and then kind of looked at different kind of class concepts as a way of understanding and analysing and critiquing those things. And then moved on to kind of specifically thinking about Marx and Weber as the founders of class analysis. I've gone into some of the work on Bourdieu, and then in the last kind of section here, given some kind of contemporary examples of how class is both still vital in terms of thinking about inequality, but how there's different ways to complexify that, and we need to kind of constantly come up with new ideas and new concepts to address those new developments in the world. Okay, thanks. I'll leave it at that.